Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of LGOtv Big Talk. And why Big Talk? Because I hate small talk. So, my guest today, I decided when I was going to start the show that I was only going to bring the most interesting guests who had the most interesting stories. And my guest today is somebody who I met a couple of years ago at a retreat for, thinkers and writers and doers. And I remember seeing him cross the room and thinking, oh my gosh, I've heard of him. I followed that story. And, his name might not be a name on everybody's lips, but I was so geeked out that I was actually afraid to go over and sit at the table and have lunch with him. So my guest today is Simon Tam. He is an author, a musician, an activist, and he's a self-proclaimed troublemaker. So I'm vibing on this. He's best known as the founder and bassist of a band called the Slants. They are the world's first and only all-Asian American dance rock band. They have the name The Slants, and they try to get a patent for the name, and they were told by the US government that it was racist. Now, let me repeat that. They were an all Asian American band who was told that they were racist for picking a name that they wanted to reclaim as their own. In 2017, he won a landmark case in the Supreme Court unanimously, helping to expand civil liberties for marginalized populations. His work's been highlighted in over 3,000 media outlets. He's had features in 150 different countries. He's been in Rolling Stone. He's been in Time Magazine. He's been in NPR, the BBC, the New York Times, and now today, LGOtv Big Talk. So welcome to the show, Simon.
Well, thank you so much for having me.
So I want to get to the whole story, but as somebody whose husband is a bass player, I always feel like I have to ask this question. And you're now my second bassist who's on the show. Why the bass? Why'd you pick up the bass?
Well, I think it started with Guns N' Roses. I think when I watched, I grew up in the 80s, and I remember watching a number of their videos and thinking, like, who's that guy and what is that sound? And it was obviously it was Duff McKagan playing like these really incredible bass lines that are rooted in blues and jazz theory, but combining with rock and roll. And I thought, like, that's what I want to do. I also thought that guitars were kind of a little overplayed out. Like, everybody was playing guitar, and my parents would not let me pick up the drums. So bass it was.
When I turned 45 a few years ago, I actually turned to my husband and I was like, I want a drum set. And he was like, you don't play music. And I was like, exactly. Like, I figured I don't have any control over my body and time and space, and I can't read music. So why not pick up the drums? And I might have been better at the bass. The drums, it sounded like. So you're starting to pick up the bass. You're joining bands. Were you always in a band? Like, was it like from the beginning? Was it like you got a bunch of buddies together and you jammed in the garage?
I think it took a couple of years. Like, I took lessons for about 3 years first. I started at the age of 10. And so I didn't really know anyone else that played music other than like my cousins, but they didn't want to do the band thing. But I kept going to the record store. Like, I'd ride my bike there on the weekends, and I kept asking the employees, like, I play bass. Who else can I like start a punk band with? And eventually they connected with me with other people. And that's when I started playing in bands. So, I guess from like a teenager on. So for the past like almost 30 years, I've been playing with bands in one form or another.
And how many bands did you have to go through before you found like the family that became the Slants?
Before the Slants, probably 15, 20 bands. Some bands last like a week. Some lasted a couple years.
Yeah.
That's especially how it is in high school. You're like, oh yeah, let's start a band. And you realize that no one could play, or you didn't get along, and just you started a new band, and oftentimes it was with the exact same people.
Yeah. So you weren't like Wild Stallions?
No. Although I will say that there was like one of my best friends. He had this younger brother, and we needed a third person in our band. He played drums and I played bass, but I was writing the songs on guitar, and I was like, let's just teach him how to play bass, and then he'll be in the band. And we played together for many years, and eventually, fast forward like 5 years after I already moved across the country, when I was starting the Slants, I called him up and I was like, hey, you got to move here and do this. You need to change your life. San Diego is a terrible place to live. You need to live in Portland. And so he moved up and joined the band.
There's something about being a bass player that I think is so fascinating. I'm a rower and I'm small for a rower, so I tend to be in bow seat. And when you're in bow seat, if you're not in a boat that has a coxswain, so the person who's driving the boat, in bow seat, you have to be steering from, turning backwards all the time. And when I first started rowing, my rowing coach said, you should just learn how to bow, because no matter how terrible of a rower you are, there's always going to be a spot for you in a boat. Right? So I feel like the bassist is really the savior of the band, because they're the one, like, you can't not have them. You have to have, there's always a spot for bassists, but it's hard to find a good bassist.
I think bass players are kind of underappreciated. Like, a lot of default bass players are guitarists who are like, oh, there's fewer strings, it must be easier. But I think playing a bass well requires a very particular mindset. It's like knowing where your place is and how you could support everybody else, how you could bring up the rhythm and the groove. And so I have a special appreciation for people who can know how to do that. Just like I think a really, really good rhythm guitarist is oftentimes underrated just because they don't have the flashy solos or anything like that. But I'm like, but it's ultimately the rhythm. That's what gets people dancing. That's what drives the melody and allows other things like the singer to flourish.
Well, there's no small amount of pattern here, right? So you're the bassist, you're carrying the rhythm, you're helping other people flourish, and you find yourself standing, with a case in front of the Supreme Court on behalf of an entire population of marginalized people. So we're going to get to that, but that's a really interesting note there. There's a personality trait, I think, that's in there that carries through. So you start the band, and you're starting to find some success, and you decide to patent the name. You don't have to patent the name, so why go for that?
Well, we decided to apply for like a trademark registration because an attorney recommended it. He's like, this is something really common for bands to do. Like as you're popping up, as you're making headlines, like this is standard practice because you want to be able to protect your intellectual property rights. And many record labels, licensing deals, many instrument companies, they actually won't work with you unless you can actually protect all of your rights, because they don't want to invest all this money and time and energy into something that's only gonna be lost to someone else. So you need to get your affairs in order. And of course, back then I thought, this sounds really expensive. But he assured me, he's like, oh, don't worry, it's only a few $100, and in 6 months the whole thing will be over. It took a lot longer and was way more expensive than that.
So I remember reading in your book Slanted how an Asian American troublemaker took on the Supreme Court, which I would recommend. I wrote a book, but the Book Authority didn't call it the best book on the Constitution of all time. So kudos to you, man. But I remember reading in the book that there were moments where you were in the back of the van as it's breaking down, as you're trying to get from one gig to the next, and there's no money, and meanwhile you've got legal fees and all of this, all the money and the pressure and the fighting within the band. Is it really worth it? When you started off, you thought it was going to be it felt expensive when it was just a few $100 in 6 months, and it took so much more money and so much more time. Why didn't you bail out early?
I mean, there's a couple of reasons for this. I think one, I'm just can be very persistent and stubborn when it comes to things that I think are right and that it should be this. So I'm going to make it work no matter what. I think that the other part of it was a conversation that I had fairly early on with one of my attorneys. And he actually was mentored by this guy named Keith Aoki, just this renowned civil rights attorney and legal scholar who also was a musician. And he said, look, guys, this is much bigger than the band. This is much bigger than just a trademark. This deals with freedom of speech and civil liberties in a way that it's very difficult to understand, because the way they're actually enforcing this law is that they're using the law against people of color and members of the LGBTQ community. It's look at their track record, look who the law is enforced against and who it isn't, and you'll see what I'm talking about. And when I realized what they were actually doing. They were preventing people like me from reappropriating language, from taking hurtful symbols and turning them into badges of pride. I realized that I couldn't walk away from that. Like, if I had an opportunity to make a difference, why would I walk away? Everyone would understand. They would be like, we get it. It's expensive. It's taking up all your time. You're losing your career over this. But I just thought I just couldn't live with myself if I knew I could make a difference, but I stepped away. It kind of got me thinking about this idea that I oftentimes share with artists and folks who want to join the nonprofit world. And I say that the true cost of following your dreams and following your values isn't what you sacrifice in order to do that. It's what you lose when you don't, what you lose in yourself when you make those compromises over your values. And because I think in the long run, you sacrifice so much more by not following your own principles.
I think about a year ago, the renowned thinker Clayton Christensen, he passed away, and he spoke a lot about when he was at Harvard Business School, and he would look around and look at all of his classmates, and everybody was super smart and super bright, and they were all going on to these great careers. And reunion after reunion after reunion, it would be like, oh, this person got arrested, that person got lost their license. All the people were having these sort of ethical crises that were costing them a lot in terms of their career. And he said, I never did that because I never chose to cheat or to lie or do any of those things, because the way you do anything is the way you do everything. And if you don't have to put yourself in this ethical dilemma every single day, if the answer is always don't cheat, don't lie, instead of, well, maybe this time just a little, then it becomes much easier to live your life that way. And so your statement that it's really about the cost of what it is if you don't do it, right? It's like, what is that? What are you compromising in terms of your own ethics, in terms of your own, moral ground, like where you stand, and how does that impact everything else in your life, and how you think about everything else in your life really hits home with that.
Yeah, I think about it like a lot of the things I kind of look at things through the lens of the arts. My wife is a painter, and she's taught me a lot about composition. And I realized that, when it comes to these big stories you hear about in the news or people's lives, you hear about the big moments. You hear about like, oh, wow, this person achieved this incredible thing, or they started this business, they launched this thing. But very seldom do people talk about the little moments that lead up to those things. Mm-hmm. So when you look at like a painting, it's not just like a really massive brushstroke that makes the overall composition. In fact, it's the kind of culmination of all the tiny, tiny brushstrokes, each individual drop of paint that creates an overall picture. And so when you think about our own lives and what kind of picture we would like to leave, it's not like the tiny compromises don't go anywhere. It's like they do. They ultimately destroy what ultimately will be our legacy, or what we hope to leave behind. So it's very much about like making consistent choices around our values, around chasing our dreams, around all the things that we want to do, like what we hope to accomplish, and realizing that we can't compromise when it comes to certain things.
Where did the sense of righteous indignation about this issue come from? When the attorneys sat down with you and they were like, yeah, this is bigger, and you realized that it could be so much more, that it was about, that it was really about, this is like a legacy issue. Did it come from, like, did you have a parent or a teacher, or was there something in your growing up?
I think for me, at first it was kind of like very much like self-centered. It was like, oh, this is the right thing to do for us. Like, this is about the dignity
as a band,
or indignity. Yeah, the thing that I have to face. But when I started seeing how it was affecting other people, I just kind of realized like, wow, it's not just about me. In fact, bands come and go all the time. They break up all the time for any number of reasons. And what do I want at the end of the day when I'm reflecting upon the decisions made? Do I want to be like the guy who just chose the easy route, or do I want to be the person that was willing to stand up for others who had to face the same kind of like indignities that I had to face with the government, using a law that was on its face supposedly like being used to protect us when that ultimately was a joke. I mean, you had the government saying like, oh, we care about racism, we care about how these things affect your communities. But I'm like, that's not true. This law was written in the middle of the Jim Crow era. This law is being used to uphold and protect white supremacist groups. Like, we need to have equal footing to be able to combat people using our tools, the tools of our community, which happen to be the arts, satire, wit, parody. And we need to have that level playing field. That's why the First Amendment is so essential. Like, you have to sometimes protect the speech that you don't like in order to ensure that the stuff you do like really has a chance of making it.
I've always struggled with that. When I did executive search, I did it specifically for nonprofits, and there were some clients that I didn't necessarily want to work for. I mean, I believe in free speech, but I felt funny working for organizations that were protecting the rights for Nazis to walk down Main Street.
Yeah.
That's a really tricky thing. This question of protecting the free speech that you don't necessarily agree with.
Yeah, I absolutely understand that. But at the end of the day, when we look at who's in power, we don't want to let those people be able to like wipe away the rights of those who are not in power, because it tends to be groups that are traditionally marginalized, which happens to be people of color, people who don't identify with kind of mainstream groups. A lot of times I think about it like this. There's an old philosopher named John Rawlings who talked about fairness and equality. And he said that the rules that are the most fair are those that we would all agree to, no matter who was in charge. So when you think about it like that, of course, freedom of speech makes sense, because you want to make sure that, hey, at the end of the day, everyone has a chance to express themselves. Because if you and I get to make the rules for other people, including people we don't like, well, those tables might turn. They might end up being in charge. Or if we make rules about what kinds of media and press gets to cover the president, maybe we'll get a president who doesn't like certain channels and discriminate. We see this happening right now, or even like who gets permits to be able to protest in the streets over their own basic human rights. Mm-hmm. Like, this is why we have to fundamentally protect everyone's right to expression in a way that doesn't violate, those exceptions. Like, obviously threats and violence and that sort of thing are not acceptable in any kind of situation. But when it comes to the actual expression of views and ideas, we absolutely need to protect them. And then we use better speech in order to kind of to win at the end of the day. Because like when you take that right from other people, they don't change their hearts and minds. They actually get even more angry and they kind of double down in their positions. So that's what we saw happening, and why we see the huge rise of white supremacy right now, because people felt like they were being silenced instead of, actually communicated it with, worked with, and won over.
Yeah, you've done a number of TEDx or in TED Talks, and one of the ones I really like is your talk on how to talk with a white supremacist. And you talk in the talk about how you were originally going to name it "How to Talk to a White Supremacist," and you're like, actually, that doesn't get us anywhere. We have to talk with people, not to people. And I love that. I think one of the nuances that I didn't understand when I was younger that I understand now is that freedom of speech is okay as long as it also comes with freedom of consequence, right? Like you can say whatever you want. The world's going to react to you. The marketplace is going to react to you. So as you're pushing forward this court case, you're getting heat from people, but you're also getting heat from other Asian Americans.
A few of them, yeah. And it was mostly because people were worried, and rightfully so, about the rights of others. They're afraid that if we won, then that would allow, people like the Washington football team to win, because they were in the middle of a court case that potentially could have their trademark registrations canceled. But what those people didn't understand, that even if they had their trademarks successfully canceled, they wouldn't have to change their name. They could keep it and they would still get their trademark rights. That lawsuit was more about the principle, more of a symbolic victory more than anything else. And so, I just kind of thought, I was like, if that's your end goal, well, this isn't the means to do it. And especially when the price that you're paying to get that goal is the suppression of the rights of nonprofits, artists, and others who traditionally have already been systemically discriminated against by the government. Like the way to do it, the way to create sustainable change is changing hearts and minds. And we see that now, because even though I won my case, the Washington football team did decide to drop their racist name. And we saw record numbers of Native American mascots being changed and pulled from high schools, colleges, and professional sports across the board.
Yeah, it is. I think that we have to have these cataclysmic moments in our country. It's like the progress is never this sort of even, slow line. It's like it comes in these fits and starts, but it takes someone like you saying, "Well, no, I'm not just going to take the answer to this trademark case as you're a racist," and look around and say, "We are all Asian." How are we racist? So I think the courage that takes, but it doesn't come without cost. I mean, there was a lot of stress within the band itself.
Yeah, unfortunately, I lost band members over it over the years, lost friends over it, because there are a number of people who said, look, I joined a band. Like, I didn't sign up for this. Yeah, like I want to tour, I want to write and play music. Instead, we're spending all this time with like lawyers and like at courts. And of course, like I wasn't doing them any favors. I was distracted. I was reading every single legal document, doing like analysis of the law myself. I didn't go to law school, but I read every single law review article possible around how this law was constructed, how it was being enforced. And so I probably knew more about this obscure provision of law than most law professors in our country, because I was spending, almost 30, 40 hours a week just studying law around this one topic. And that infuriated band members, because like on tour, I would be carrying law books with me, and they, when they wanted to hang out, I'm like, no, I got to study. We're working on the next round of our case. Or, it was difficult pulling money away from investing in our albums and publicity and everything else that a band normally needs to invest in, and paying legal bills for a case that at the end of the day, we couldn't see any way possible to victory. Like we knew it was a losing case, because we had already been losing for years. But I thought, like, it doesn't matter if we win or not. It's the fight that matters. It's like making sure that our principles are held out as long as possible.
It's so difficult, because so much of what makes a band great, like any team, whether it's, a sports team or a business team, is that charisma, or sorry, the chemistry between them, right? It's the relationship.
Sure.
It's the stuff that happens when you're not on stage that makes the stuff on stage go so well. So were there moments where you, and I know you detailed them in the book, but I want you to talk about them here, where you just were ready to give up, where you're like, it's not worth it?
All the time. Or, I mean, I would say probably the most difficult moment was as we were heading up to the federal circuit. So one level before, like below the Supreme Court, we were just struggling. I was losing band members left and right, and trying to get a new lineup together. I was struggling financially, because this is during our recession, and I lost like all employment. I had to walk away from being a full-time musician and take side hustles just to try and pay the bills. And like in the middle of that, like of me like doing things like, putting my mortgage into forbearance and only eating one meal a day because that's all I could afford, I get a bill for printing for $11,000 from the federal government. And I just thought, why am I doing this? like when you're in the middle of that moment, you're choosing between like eating and taking care of your loved ones and like trying to survive, and you're paying for copies and staples. It's like ridiculous. But I just knew that I needed to step back from that moment. As you mentioned, like the path to justice is not a straight line. It's like these mountains and these peaks, but you can only see that if you step away and look at that much bigger picture. Like, what are we trying to affect here? What kind of change do we hope to accomplish? And what do I need to like do to get there? Sometimes that means like doing the things that we don't want to do in order to get to a place where we want to be.
Was there a part of you in that moment? I think a lot about the burden of potential and this moment where you look around and you're like, the world should be a certain way. And if it should be a certain way, somebody's got to make it that way. And like, I guess if someone's got to make it that way, it's gonna have to be me right now at this moment because I'm the one whose position I'm here, and I didn't ask for this, but holy shit, here I am, and I have this potential to make that change, this thing that I know in my core and my soul to be right. The burden of that is super heavy, and carrying that is hard. There must, but you said earlier, like you just, it was a losing case, right? There must have been some glimmer, some hope, some something, or was this just at this point you're just full on like Don Quixote tilting at windmills, saying we're going to take it as far as we can take it, and at least have it heard enough times that eventually the arc of justice, the arc will bend towards justice.
I think there's a couple ways to look at it. One of it is one of those ways is thinking like even if it's a losing case, like it's the act of fighting, it's the act of resistance that matters, because by doing so, by being persistent and consistent with that, you can oftentimes change the culture if your story spreads. Like that's one facet. And another is like I hadn't exhausted all possible options yet. It was a losing case, but maybe one day our story would reach the highest levels of the court or even reach the White House and somehow get someone to change something, someone who was in power who could identify with our cause. And ultimately, that's both things happened. Like we were able to share our story so many times and use kind of this unconventional path to get to the Supreme Court and to kind of win hearts and minds that people became more aware of it. And that's the nature that like kind of the power of publicity. Like, I will tell you this, that I don't know of anyone else who's had a case before the Supreme Court that went on tour. Like we toured law schools, every single bar association they could find in the country. We toured city and state legislative offices to tell our story again and again and again. I just thought, hopefully this will trickle up to the ears of the clerks of the Supreme Court so someone could hear what this case is about, because there are certain arguments that one would like to make, certain principles that you're fighting for that don't make sense in a legal brief, things that attorneys will never say before the courts because they're afraid that they'll lose the case. But I'm like, those are the things that need to be said. There are things I wish we would have included, but I knew they were not winning arguments at the Supreme Court, but they were things that still needed to be said. So that's why I created a platform to do that, because I was like, people need to hear this, whether it wins our case or not. And it's the same thing with like this idea of like advocating for those to protect the views of people who don't agree with you. Like much to the chagrin of my attorneys, when I encountered social justice groups that didn't agree with me, I said, you should file a case against me. You should file a brief against me at the Supreme Court. Of course, they were always taken aback, like, wait, why are you telling us this? Why would you want this? I'm like, because the court needs to hear all possible avenues of how this case might affect people. And your perspective is valid. I respect your work. We work together in other areas. You should file a case and we'll see who wins out. And I think at the end of the day, every one of those groups that filed legal briefs against me, when I went back to them and spoke with them years later, they all said they regretted that decision. They said at the end of the day that we were right once they actually had the full context of the story. But no one's ever going to feel that way if they feel unheard, if they feel victimized, if they feel like you're only suppressing their story. So that's why I'm like, let's all have an open debate. Let's have a conversation about this and let the best ideas win. So those are just some of the kind of things that like, I knew that like it wasn't going to help me win, but I knew that it was important to my principles, and that's why I had to do those things.
So at what point then do you get the call that it's like, actually, you got in the ear of somebody who is going to make a difference, who's going to help you get this to the next level?
I never really got that call. There was never really like an assurance that things were gonna be okay, other than when I was sitting in the courtrooms, like as our case was being argued at the federal circuit, I thought, okay, I could pick out the judges and say, I can see people who seem to be on our side and people who definitely on our side. I didn't know that we would win by a vast majority at the federal circuit. I thought, oh, the things aren't looking so good for us. When we got to the Supreme Court, I thought things probably like are going our way, but I couldn't quite tell. I never in a million years would have predicted that it would be unanimous. Like that just blew me away. And the first time I heard about that was when I saw on Twitter, like before I got a call, I saw on Twitter that the Supreme Court ruled in our favor. And I was like, oh, wow. Like I finally did it.
That's incredible that you saw. That's such a statement of this age that you saw it on Twitter first. I've always thought it must be so incredibly frustrating to be waiting for someone else to state your case, like sitting in either whether you're sitting in the courtroom and somebody else is describing the story, giving the arguments, all that, and then to not be in the room, like when this whole thing is about being heard and being seen for who you actually are. It's almost like the ultimate irony that you had to be silent in this
Oh,
process.
of course. I mean,
It would make me crazy.
I was like, I mean, think about this. I was fighting for freedom of speech in the nation's highest court. And in that courtroom, I can't say a damn thing. I have to sit there because if I say anything, even like, hey, I'm the guy. Let me tell you, I would get kicked out like without hesitation. And so like, yeah, it's very frustrating. But I thought about as frustrating as that experience was, like in terms of not being able to advocate myself, there are millions of people who are in that exact same boat. Millions of Americans right now are experiencing discrimination and they live lives like that are just being discriminated against by the system in education and law and employment and finance. It's incredibly degrading, and oftentimes they can't advocate for themselves, which is why we need allies, why we need people who have a platform to be willing to step up and make some noise when they see injustice.
Yeah, make good trouble, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. And so the case finally, at long last, you win, you're done. Are your bandmates like, thank God we don't have to do this anymore? We can just go make music?
I think
Or that's what they knew. They knew you were done. You were going to be a troublemaker forever.
They initially thought like, hey, now we could focus on our records until they, the thing is like the case is never done. Like even after it was resolved, I was still working with community organizations to not only like make sure people fully understand it and fully understand their rights after my case was resolved, but also to help on other cases. There were adjacent cases that were going to the Supreme Court around freedom of expression. So, for example, last year I signed onto a brief with a bunch of rappers like Killer Mike, Chance the Rapper, Meek Mill, because we're trying to advocate that, like, hey, rap lyrics shouldn't be used as threats, as violence. They're artistic works. And that was something we were petitioning the Supreme Court over. The obscure law that I was fighting only dealt with one word in this whole sentence. The sentence was problematic, not just that one word. So the following year, there was another case that went to the Supreme Court, and I filed a legal brief in support of that case as well to kind of strike down the entire law. The work is never really quite done. And I think this whole journey kind of taught my band members that we're not just a band. Like whether we want that or not, like we are artists and we are activists. We're seeking to make change through our music, but sometimes that change comes about in other kinds of surprising ways. That's why we spent the last year and a half really founding and establishing a nonprofit organization. So we're not just the Slants anymore, we're also the Slants Foundation, and we're using all of our resources, our goodwill, our platforms to help mentor other future troublemakers across the arts. So that's, I think they kind of realize that. And while they have these dreams of being rock stars and touring and that kind of thing, I think that our arena tends to not just be in music clubs anymore. It's really about using whatever means we have at our disposal to make sure that our identity and our culture gets celebrated and highlighted. And sometimes that takes us in very uncomfortable or surprising kind of places.
And so let's talk a little bit about that foundation. So the work of the foundation is to amplify underrepresented voices, particularly in the Asian community, through arts, through activism, through social change? Are you training activists, or are you just helping them find their voice? Or are you just mentoring them? Like, what's the work that goes into what you're doing?
So a lot of it is it's kind of centered around like finances. We fund them like a traditional arts organization might, but with that, we don't just give them like a check to fund a work. We try and fund their career, and so with that comes mentorship. So we connect them with an industry veteran to help guide their career, help them make decisions, help them help connect them with others who are doing similar work. And of course, we tie it back to activism by connecting them with a local community organization that they can volunteer with or partner up with, both to hold them accountable for their like activist message, but also so that they have a network of folks that they can rely on. I think so often artists tend to go at this work alone. They oftentimes only have YouTube videos and books to kind of have answers, but sometimes their particular situation might not be relevant to the information they're searching for. So what we try and do is make sure that they have that coach, which is as you know, like an incredibly important resource. And we collect best practices across the country, and we reshare that information across kind of our network of artists. So our all volunteer board is small, but very nimble, and it allows us to kind of come up with like really unique solutions to things. For example, this year when we saw COVID hitting, there were two problems that we identified. One, a sharp increase in discrimination against Asians and Asian Americans in this country.
Yes.
And two, a severe lack of funding for the arts. Like, many people were talking about restaurants and other small businesses, the performing artists, not so much. And so we decided to launch a grant to fund artists who wanted to kind of address the problem of anti-Asian discrimination using art. So we called it Countering Hate with Art. And we funded artistic works that were seeking to strike important conversations rooted in empathy and compassion. And so, we were able to fund a number of artists, and we still have them in our network, so we can kind of continue to coach them and help them and build not only like sustainable practices for their career, but also scalable, because we want to be able to share those practices with others who are kind of aiming to create change using their work.
I think the sustainability question is such an interesting one, and I'm sure the creating some of the work that your foundation does is based directly on your own experience of like being in the back of the van carrying the law books and the amps and trying to figure out like, why am I doing this? And there's no role model, there's nobody that you can lean on, there's no one who comes before. And we also live in this world where so many people are more committed than thou, right? So many people are like, you're not doing enough, you're never doing enough, let me see, and there's this almost like purpose shaming that goes on with people. It's like it can never be enough. And so there you are, you're realizing that you can speak for other people, that you are literally on the stage, that you have the platform. And as an artist, you're probably feeling things more deeply, right? You're like sort of more empathetic, you have more of the sort of emotional core than your average human. And it's hard to not burn out on that. It's hard to do it, and at the same time figure out like, can I eat 2 meals today, or am I just going to eat one? So in the having this kind of mentorship and just not being alone must be such a gift for these artists.
I think so. I mean, I think I just kind of reflect on my career and think like, what is it that I wish I had when I was starting out, whether it was knowledge or connections or anything like that. And for many of the artists that I'm working with now, they send me just the most incredible stories and letters all the time. And most of them just say like, having someone believe in me has made all the difference. I think like when a person feels empowered, when they feel like, hey, I'm not necessarily bound by the circumstances of the moment because I have someone who believes in me, who's there to fall back on. A lot of times it allows people to unlock this potential that they don't realize is in themselves. And that's the power of like equipping of other people, of mentoring them, of teaching them. And that's one of the things that I find like the most rewarding about starting this organization. Like I always grew up thinking I was gonna like do music and play bass forever and rock stages across the world. But this provides me with a level of reward and fulfillment that no stage ever has provided. I still love playing music, by the way, but this is just seeing other people be able to do it, and like when they see that potential unlocked in themselves, it's the most incredible thing. I wouldn't give it up for anything.
Does it ever intimidate you, the amount of influence you have over some of the artists you work with?
I don't know if I have that much. I'm not sure. I try not to think about like how much or how little influence I have. I just think like, hey, if I could speak truth to the situation, and if I could get someone to see that and to change it, then great. Um, I think what's intimidating for me is just the scope of work. We have a lot of work to do. And I'm just working on a small sliver of that little intersection between arts and activism, and particularly around Asian and Asian American artists. Like, there's a lot more work beyond that, and of course, we're trying to partner up with organizations and other folks to do that. But like, I try not to get overwhelmed by it and just think like, what is that big picture? Like, what is the change that I hope to make? And think like, okay, where are those tiny areas that I can work on to get to that picture? Knowing that I'm not alone in this. Like, I have a whole board of directors there, and I have volunteers, I have a support network. I have other organizations who are each contributing their own thing to kind of, as you mentioned, like bend that moral arc of the universe towards justice a little bit more. And so if I could do that and help people create some really amazing art in the process, then any kind of trepidation I might feel immediately fades away.
Yeah, I had somebody come up to me once at an event, and she was like, "I'm so excited that you're speaking at this event today. I got your book last week, and I read the first half of it, and I quit my job yesterday." And I wanted to be like, "Read the second half first."
Yeah, read the whole book.
And so there is something to being put in somebody's mind as an expert, and then you suddenly have to have expertise, and we're all just kind of making it up as we go along, right? We're all figuring it out. So, with the foundation, you have a board, you partner with other organizations. Where does the funding come from?
A lot of it comes from me, book sales, speaking engagements, and that sort of thing, and a lot of small donations. It's incredible. Like, the average gift we get is probably less than $50, but all those little small hands adds up to a whole lot. We're also applying for arts grants ourselves to try and get pass-through funding, so that it can just go from us doing the heavy lifting of the paperwork and the applications and passing it directly to the artists themselves. So since we're volunteer driven, 100% of our profit or money or income goes directly to programs, which is like pretty incredible.
That is amazing. That is amazing. And so I have here on the bottom scroll for anybody who's watching this, where people can find out more information at theslants.com/foundation. But we'll make sure to put in the show notes also places where people are interested in donating. They can do that. Now, I know you just moved to Cincinnati, which is where my husband was born and raised. But you did something really interesting. I know you bought an old house, but you're using the first floor to highlight art.
Yeah, we're actually working on creating an art gallery here in an event space when one day we have events once more, because I want to provide a center for local artists, especially artists who are doing unconventional works. Like, this is, I guess, if there's a theme to a lot of the work that I do, it's that I like unconventional things. And because, when it comes to the art that's displayed in galleries and museums, it tends to be very similar. To certain styles are lifted up over others. Like, contemporary and modern art is revered in a way that, say, surrealism oftentimes isn't, unless, Dali. But other than that, most people can't name a single other surreal artist or an Art Nouveau artist. So what if we lifted up other folks who are doing some interesting work that we think deserve to be seen? And so, that's what we're trying to do with the house. Plus, it's like this really old Victorian house, and there's a lot of charm. It looks like an old wizard lives here. So I think it could make for a very cool environment. And I can also use it to have performers and raise money for other nonprofits. So it's really exciting.
I love that unconventional thinking. It is so in line with the way that I think about the world, right? The sort of limitless idea that you don't have to accept everyone else's definition of what you should be and how you should live and what your house should look like and what you should use it for. And I think it's such a fantastic way to everybody else looks for work-life balance, and I think what you've done is you create this work-life alignment where every part of what you do, it's not like the band is over here and the social justice is over there. It's not like you're living over here and the arts are over there. You figured out a way that that you have melded who you are and what you do in every aspect of your life. So that theme that we're seeing, throughout, of bringing people together, of uplifting them, of sort of carrying the rhythm, of this, of your moral stance throughout your life is really beautiful in how you've done that.
Oh,
So now I have to
bass
ask, so
players,
you're
right?
bass players, absolutely. So I have to ask, so you're married also,
I am.
and is your wife like, I'm awesome, let's have total stranger come into our living room, no worries? I mean, is she like totally in for this thing, or did that take some convincing also?
No, she was on board. This was a joint idea. So what's funny is like we're both introverts. We both like being secluded and doing our own work. But I think we just kind of realized that we wanted to be able to build a community of people with similar values and interests. And, we're both really passionate about the arts. She's this incredible painter who does, surrealist works that are rooted in fantasy and fairy tales. She writes books on fairy tales. And it's like, how could we find other people who are doing this kind of work? How could we collaborate with them so that we can kind of further lift up this kind of overlooked aspect of culture? And so when we saw this house, we knew that this would be a great place for that kind of thing. It's funny because right now we're addicted to HGTV, which anybody who's moving probably is. And like we watch all these shows and people always talk about like, oh, I want an open kitchen. I want to do this thing it's a great space for entertaining. Like you hear that all the time. It's like, well, we don't necessarily want to like entertain. We want to build community. So what can we do to redesign a space to do that? So right now we're using the second floor as our offices and our living spaces, and the bottom floors can be dedicated to like a community space. And what's great is that we learned that this house has a lot of history, both in law and in arts. So this was the first Solicitor General of Cincinnati actually was gifted this house like in the 1800s. So it has a history of like people who were fighting for the civil liberties of other folks. And it was also the childhood home of a renowned wildlife painter, John Ruthven. And so it's kind of funny because our life is kind of like that as well. It just was a perfect symbol of all those things.
Now, did you know that when you were buying the house, or did you learn that after?
We learned it when we showed up early and the previous homeowners were still cleaning. They gave us a tour of everything and they showed us all this cool history. There are floorboards here that could be removed because John Ruthven's grandmother hid gin in them because it was during Prohibition. A lot of the homes in this neighborhood actually had secret pubs in their basements. And so it was just like, I don't know, I'm always fascinated by history, and I just thought this was just so cool. And how could we honor that history? How could we honor that legacy while kind of reshaping the future?
Oh man, all we have in the house that we bought was a giant dragon painted on the floor of the third
What?
floor attic. And I was like, and there's like this little teeny cupboard room off the attic. And I turned to my husband, I was like, oh man, this is definitely where the kids who used to this is where the kids who used to live here smoked up. Like, it. There's just so we actually left the dragon there on the floor.
That's
We put a
awesome.
rug above it, but we did leave the dragon because it's literally this like 12-foot giant dragon painted on the floors. We didn't find any gin or a pub in the basement, sadly. That would have
No,
been way better.
we're actually working on creating secret entrances, like because I've always wanted one, like a bookcase that you like pull the right book out and it opens a door or something like that. So I finally got permission from my significant other to do this. So that's going to be my project, building this thing sometime in the next year.
Well, we did actually do one of those. We turned that third floor into a guest room, and the little secret cupboard room. I actually made a door. Well, I didn't make it, but we had somebody make a door. That's the linen shelves, and so you open the door and there's the linens, and then if you push that open, it opens up into this little like eave area. So
That's
we put
amazing.
the spin bike in there. That's where I go to sweat. It's not that exciting, unfortunately, but there's so many fun things that you can do when you have that space. And I think that it's almost your responsibility to imbue the home with even more cool, fun history, since you are
Yeah.
now you're now the stewards of the history that's been there.
Yeah, why not? I think space matters. I think it's not just like I could just have like an office and I could have bedrooms and that kind of thing. But as artists, as people who want to create things in the world, it's great to be not only inspired by your space, but like energized by it. And like we want people to feel that energy when they come into this home as well, whether it's guests or when we have an art space, like we want people to come in and think like, hey, that doesn't look quite right, or that doesn't look like what I expected. And it's like, this is all a giant metaphor of like, you can take a non-traditional approach to a house, just like you can for your art, just like you can to your personal life, your work and your achievements. Like figure out how to develop these unique perspectives, sometimes hidden under layers or under these places that you can provide nuance where people weren't expecting it. And that's how you really create something that can be fulfilling, and really something that is sustainable, because you want it to have a little bit of legacy. Like if you're creating art, when you release it into the world, it changes the relationship of it, because it's not just like what a creator puts out there. Just like an author just can't write a book and say like, well, that's the story, this is exactly what it means. Because when someone else reads it and they have their own life experiences and perspective and values applied to it, it changes. Like the symbols kind of take on a new shape. And like that's what we're trying to do with our work, and that's what we're trying to do with our lives, like imbue it with meaning so it could change that relationship with other folks.
If space matters, and I believe it does, do you think that you would have retain the same amount of fight for the court case if you weren't like in the van in crappy hotel rooms, if you were cush and comfortable and everything was fine and you were living in like a fancy suburban home and driving a fancy car, and do you think you would have fought it as long as you did? Or do you think some of the fact that you were in this like rock and roll, fight the power space help to keep some of the fight in you?
I think, yeah. I mean, I've never really thought about it like that, but I think that a certain element of that scrappiness came from being in that kind of environment. It's kind of funny because I think in a lot of ways it brings up this idea that people say all the time of like, oh, this person has privilege, or there's a white privilege, or that kind of thing. The thing about privilege is that we're blind to it. If you're comfortable, if you're not struggling, the stakes aren't as high. Like
Right.
if you're sending your kids to a private school and the public education sector is failing, like it doesn't matter to you quite as much. Or
Hmm.
if a certain neighborhood is experiencing a lot of transformation and its local residents are getting kicked out, but you're not really a part of it. You may visit there to, I don't know, hit up a bakery or a new up and coming restaurant. You don't see the changes taking place and how it's affecting people. Your relationship with that outcome is a little bit different. But when you're kind of in it, like I think, when we were going through our court case, we saw like how other nonprofits, how other artists are struggling with it. Like I connected with other people who were rejected for their own trademarks for similar reasons as mine. I surrounded myself in that environment. That's how I knew. I was like, oh, this is a lot different than even the people who were opposing my case weren't seeing all of these things because they didn't have that same experience themselves.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's like when you see straight cisgendered wealthy white male say, "Well, have you ever noticed that white people don't seem to get roughed up by police at traffic violations?" It's like, well, how many times have you been pulled over? Okay, now let's have a conversation. But I think there's it is we live in this world that's increasingly siloed, where you can send your kid to private school and not worry about the public school system. You can get your news from one outlet and not have it not be challenged by having to think about somebody else's opposing belief. You can isolate yourself from specific individuals, so that you only see people that agree with you, or you don't have to drive into a certain neighborhood because the food can be delivered to you. And I think I worry about that, this increasingly siloed universe that we have. And what I love about what you're doing is, I think art so often is a language that we can all share. We sort of all can see it, we can all hear it, we can all experience it. And even though we experience it differently, it's something that does still have the potential to bring people together.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things I love about it, about music, comedy, film. There are ways to change the culture, and that are oftentimes unexpected. I they're just as important to movements of activism as actually advocating for policy and working ballot boxes. That's why I believe in this idea of justice. Like, supporting the arts isn't just charity. It's not just entertainment. It is justice, because the arts provide that all important mirror for our society that we need to see ourselves in. We need to see that light. But they also provide kind of a looking glass into the future of possibility of like what can be if we actually invest ourselves as a culture into the values that we seek.
Arts, supporting the arts is not just charity, it's justice. I can't think of a better note to end on than that. So that's what we're going to end on. Tell the fine people who are listening or watching where they can connect with you, where they can learn about you, where they can support you if they want to do more.
I'm on social at Simon the Tam across all platforms. My personal website, simontam.org, and there I write articles on a regular basis, and there's more information about my work. And if you're interested in supporting the work of the Slants Foundation, theslants.org is the place to do it. You can sign up to volunteer, donate, or just kind of share the work that our artists are creating.
Excellent. Thank you so much for being my guest today. And I look forward to when we can travel again. When I head to Cincinnati, we're going to go drink some gin in your basement.
That sounds good.
I know you don't have a pub down there, but we're just going to
pretend.
We're going to make it happen.
The attic is way more interesting.
Well, drink some gin in your attic. Thank you for being my guest today.
All right. Thank you.